All right. Hi, I'm Charles LaCall. I'm head of content and community for Dream Adventures. We're really excited to host this webinar on the topic of market segmentation. It's a practice and method that often gets overlooked at fast-growing startups, but the idea of market segmentation is critical for startups that have a product in market and are actually selling to customers. At its core, market segmentation is about prioritizing resources. So prioritizing your if you're a startup, your limited ad budget to achieve the largest impact with the smallest number of dollars. It's when done successfully, market segmentation can be extremely useful, can help you gain a core audience of really excited and avid users to your product. And when done poorly, market segmentation is pretty easy to spot. You can tell startups that don't have good market segmentation when you see superficial content that is not really relevant to the startup's audience, or you see startups working across multiple industries but never succeeding at becoming the go-to solution in any one of those. So that being said, we want to welcome today two amazing marketers from a company called Magma Digital, Stephen Bouikidis and Mary Jordan. Magma Digital is a marketing consultancy, and one of their core focus areas is helping large tech companies with digital strategy and go-to-market readiness. They work across healthcare, entertainment, and financial services with some of the biggest names in those industries. And with that, I am excited to welcome Stephen and Mary. I'll let them take it from here and make some introductions to themselves. All right.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Charles. Good to be talking to everyone. So first I want to introduce ourselves. I'm the Chief Digital Strategist and Principal for Magma Digital. I've been in the digital marketing game for over 20 years. And again, as Charles mentioned, across multiple industries. And I started on traditional media, so I have that traditional media and the new media mix in my background. I'm going to turn over to Mary Jordan.
Hello, everyone. Very nice to meet everyone today. My name is Mary Jordan. I've been working in marketing for over 20 years. I work with Stephen as a senior digital strategist. I have quite an extensive background from soup to nuts in digital, also traditional, working across healthcare, entertainment, and a variety of other technology industries. And I'm also about 3 months away from finishing my doctoral degree in marketing as well. So I'm excited to be here.
Okay, all right, I'm going to pass this on to Maggie, and what we're going to talk about here, I just give you a lay of the land, is what is marketing segmentation, common ways to segment markets, segment selection, segmentation exercise, if we have time, some case studies, tools, and resources. And we'll be embedding and talking about tools and resources as we're going through the webinar. And we're going to, as questions come through, we'll let you know, how to respond and what to do next. So I'm going to turn this over to Maggie.
Okay, perfect. Thanks so much, Stephen. So to get things kicked off, we wanted to start talking about marketing segmentation, just a very, very brief overview from a very top level. I also should mention that we did take a look at some of the questions that were sent through, so we're going to try our best to address as many of those questions throughout the dialogue as we can. And if for some reason we missed something, feel free to bring those up at the end. Happy to jump in. So I want to take an opportunity to get everybody thinking about market segmentation. So if you can use your chat box on the right-hand side, if you just shoot over just what comes to mind. It could be a word, it could be a phrase, doesn't matter. What comes to mind when you think of the term market segmentation? Niche focus, that's actually a really great point. So a lot of times you've probably heard of niche marketing, different customer segments. Absolutely, this is definitely a marketing focused discipline that we're talking about right now. Targeting buyers, absolutely right. These are all 100% right in the realm of where we're looking to get to. A breakdown of customers' pain points, that's a favorite of mine. It's one of the things we'll talk about a little bit today is about target markets and how that relates to the communication to those particular target markets. I'm also seeing geography, persona, 100%. You're going to hear all of these words as we start to talk through today. So heading over to the next slide. So what is market segmentation? So the first thing I just want to set the stage with our conversation here is that companies cannot appeal to all consumers in the same way at the same time. The question that comes from that statement is, why not? I would love to take my product and go out and try to sell it to every single person out there. And in a perfect world, we would love to be able to do that. However, it's just not feasible. If you think about all of the resources, especially at the startup stage, you know, Stephen and I have a lot of experience with startups, and oftentimes you're fighting over, well, do we do this or do we do that, or do we go after these people or those people? And unfortunately, we can't hit every single person in the entire world. It's just not feasible. And also, you're going to end up diluting what you're trying to do. If you're trying to message to one group and the other group at the same time, and you don't have the appropriate resources, it's just going to cost a lot of money, it's going to cost a lot of time, and you're going to end up, it's going to backfire in the long run. So I know somebody was asking about some of the risks of market segmentation. Those are exactly some of the risks, is trying to do too much at the same time, trying to go after too many segments, and going after segments that just don't make any sense or that haven't been vetted appropriately. So we'll talk more about that throughout the day as well. So when we take a look at from a business strategy perspective, the strategy really comes into play with two different groups. The first is the customer selection and market segmentation, which is what we're going to talk about today. And then the other part is the value proposition and differentiation and positioning. That's sort of a second part to this particular conversation. We're definitely going to focus on the left-hand side of this chart, but one of the things we also want to mention is that defining your target market is only the first step. The second step, obviously, is once we understand who those people are, what's important to them, how can we message to them, and also how do we position against anything else that might be out there in the market, whether it be substitutions, competitors, or anything like that. So we're going to focus mostly on identifying target markets. But something to keep in mind is that there's another conversation around, okay, now that we know who they are, how are we going to go after them and how are we going to message? Okay.
Okay.
And yes, I believe there will be a recording of this webinar. Okay, perfect. So market segmentation, a definition. I've been going to school for a long time, so I always like to make sure that everyone has a definition to check that box. So first of all, segmentation, dividing all customers or businesses into smaller groups or segments. The one thing we want everybody to realize here that market segmentation isn't necessarily always just customers. It can also be businesses. If you're a B2B company, your target market could be a group of businesses. So we're going to start filtering some of that in as well throughout the conversation so that you'll be able to see how that works. And then targeting is the selection of those particular segments to market your product or service. So essentially you have the what and then being able to decide which one to go after. Okay. One other thing I do want to point out, though, before we move on into an example, is I know there was a question about market segmentation versus customer segmentation. And Stephen, feel free to jump in here. But when I think about the two, the market segmentation, I really think about as more of a top-down view. So if we're doing business planning, we're looking at what target markets do we want to go after, and we'll talk about some ways to define those and also to be able to decide which ones are most viable. But customer segmentation, in my view, is more of a bottoms-up approach. So for example, a great example of that would be, I did a lot of work with SiriusXM radio in the past. I know that's not a healthcare example, but we had a massive customer database and we did a lot of customer segmentation. So when we went into the database, we would say, okay, what group of customers are most likely to respond to this particular program? Or what type of product could we build to be able to target this group of customers? So rather than thinking top down and building something that I'm going to create for the market itself, I'm looking at what actually exists as customers and building something to be able to address those particular needs. So it's just a little bit of a different perspective. Stephen, anything else you wanted to add?
No, I think that's a great way to look at it. I mean, usually you have your markets identified, the big broad markets identified, and then the big task really is getting down to those customers. And I would say that's usually what happens. Usually people look at the big market and they don't look at the bottoms up approach, which is really where you're going to be able to do the most effective marketing. So that's I think a good thing to really kind of talk about it in that framework.
Absolutely. And it's also a good idea to think about both sides as well, because if you think about it, you're obviously going to be planning at the top level, but once you start bringing people in the door and you start creating these relationships, it's great to bring people, start to go after target markets, but then being able to understand what you're going to do with them once they're in the door is something that a lot of companies fail to do. And as I mentioned, we're not going to go too much into the communication to these particular customers, but making sure that once you have them in the door, you're not forgetting about them and not forgetting to take care of them. So just a really quick example, and we'll use the chat box again if anybody wants to jump in. So we wanted to use more of a consumer example purely because it's a great way to describe customer segmentation at a very fundamental level. One of my favorite examples is Starbucks and Dunkin' Donuts. So I probably should have done a poll who prefers Starbucks versus Dunkin' Donuts, but we won't go there. But if you think about the two different products against each other, they obviously are trying to do two very, very different things in the marketplace. But if you think about it at a very fundamental level, they're both providing a very similar service. At the very most basic level, Starbucks, I'm going to get a coffee. Dunkin' Donuts, I'm going to get a coffee. Now, obviously, they do offer other things, but we're going to leave it at this very basic level just for this exercise. So if you think about serving coffee from Starbucks and Dunkin' Donuts, what would the segments look like for each of these brands? So if you think about a customer that walks in the door for a Starbucks coffee, what are some ways you could actually describe those people? Any thoughts? Starbucks is more upscale, busy professionals. Starbucks equals the experience, absolutely. So hipsters, students. So Starbucks has always taken that kind of approach, which is the more experience-driven, upscale. They obviously charge more for their coffee. More expensive. I'm glad somebody just said that as I was saying it. So it's definitely a little bit of a different picture. So that if you flip over to Dunkin' Donuts and you compare that, the Dunkin' Donuts, I believe their tagline right now is America runs on Dunkin'. So they're, a little bit less expensive. They do go for a lot of variety as well, but it's a little bit of a different variety. Their ad campaigns are much, much different than Starbucks. Less exclusive, someone just said, absolutely. So they're trying to focus on being more core to the American feeling. So America runs on Dunkin', where Starbucks is trying to be a little bit more exclusive in how they message. And yep, Dunkin' Donuts absolutely has some offerings other than coffee as well. But they, for the coffee example, this is kind of comparing the two side by side. So how do they deliver value to the segments? So if we think to ourselves, coffee is coffee, and it kind of blows my mind if you go back 30 years ago, coffee, and how Starbucks does it today, it's revolutionary what they did. So the value that they're delivering to each segment is very different. So the value to Starbucks, as you guys were talking about, was the experience. I walk into a Starbucks, it's very consistent. I come in, they have their baristas, they have a lot of different more upscale offerings, their product line, and everything that they do. And I believe somebody was asking about, let me actually pull that question up. Sorry, that actually is related to something else. I'll talk about that in a little bit. When you think about how products are developed, that is very, very driven by that target market. So if you think about Starbucks and they say, okay, we're going to try to go after a more upscale audience, people who are willing to pay more money for a coffee, we're going to develop an experience that's going to fit that particular target market. And then it's interesting because when you think about the competitive landscape, and it's one of my favorite things to talk about, I like to talk about it as the competitive chessboard. So if you're Dunkin' Donuts and you rewind back in time before Starbucks existed, all of a sudden Starbucks shows up on the spot and starts to deliver this amazing experience. Dunkin' Donuts has to make a choice. They have to say, okay, do we want to also try to go upscale and try to do the same thing? Do we want to dial it back and go in a completely different direction? Where do we want to go? How do we want to fit into this picture? So it's been a very interesting, and if you look at their advertising and look at their product mix, it's a really interesting story that really develops here, because Dunkin' Donuts decided to stick to their roots and said, hey, we're actually going to be not as upscale. We're going to be more, I would call it more of a roots kind of approach. Your everyday, what you're going to go and you're going to grab your Dunkin' Donuts every day, and you're going to have a lot of different flavors, and I forget all the names of them, but and you can grab your donut. And it's like I said, America runs on Dunkin'. Much, much different message. Do you think, and I'm just going to throw this out here as rhetorical, do you think it would have worked if Dunkin' Donuts decided to go after Starbucks? Think about that. Would they have been as successful? When I think about it, I think they made the right move and went in the right direction. If they decided that they wanted to go after Starbucks, I feel that it would probably have been less successful, because they would not have stayed true to their roots and really kept that strength that made them so powerful in the first place. And that kind of ties into my third question there, which is, if one of them decided to be a little bit more like the other, that's where we get into something that's called brand dilution, which is, if Starbucks decided to scale back and be a little bit less exclusive, the people who find Starbucks so wonderful because of that experience and because of that exclusivity, they're going to start to offend those people, and that target market's going to start to dwindle away. And that goes back to what I was talking about, which is we can't be everything to everyone. So let's not try to be. Let's try to be successful in the places that we really need to be. Okay?
Okay, so in this part, what are some of the attributes that you may select to segment a market? And please use the chat for this as well. Okay, price. What else would you look for in terms of attributes? Income. Demographics. Access, age. Okay, these are great. Characteristics, age, income, geography. That's a good one. We're going to be talking about a lot of these. Psychographics, family unit. State of care for healthcare. Okay, these are great. All right, terrific. And let's see, I'll just do a couple more. Customer needs and preferences. Okay, good. We're going to get into all of these. Okay, so I'm going to just move on to the next. So here's your market. Here are the main ways to segment different markets. Geographic, again, these were mentioned. Behavioral, psychographic, and demographic. So when we look at geographic variables, we're looking at country, region, state, counties, cities, neighborhoods. You may look at urban versus rural. So there are a bunch of different geographic variables you can use to segment your audiences. And again, these can be combinations of variables. So it's not just one or the other. So just give you a good, clear example. This is an old client of mine, Berlitz. So they segmented, it was very easy, adults, teens and kids, corporations, international students. So they use a combination of like age, life cycle, gender, not gender specific, actually occupation. So they're looking for educators. They're looking at, international students, government by type. So this is, I want to kind of show you a good example of how you can use segmentation actually on your website itself. Sometimes you want to very distinctly point out, here's where the market is. If you're a corporation, click here, etc. So this is a good way of kind of very quickly addressing your market from demographic variable. Psychographic, looking at psychological attributes such as lifestyle, social preferences, personality, etc. So, somebody could be active, youthful, healthy, organic, rugged, passion for the outdoors. On the other side, tech savvy, stylish, entertainment seekers, professional, food lovers, may have a passion for travel. Maggie, is there anything else you want to add here for the psychographic?
Yes, so, and with this, it's actually pretty interesting because there's a lot of, and we'll talk a little bit about tools, but there are a lot of companies today, data providers, that are marrying a lot of professional attributes to these psychographic variables. So for example, it's fairly easy for me to go out and say, hey, I want to purchase, let's say, a list of healthcare companies, or let me even use a healthcare example, physicians. I want to get a list of all neurologists and their related mid-level practitioners within the United States. It's fairly easy for me to go and get that information, find out their prescribing behavior, but there are companies today that are actually marrying that information through to their psychographic variables. Are they focused on green efforts or organic? What kinds of television shows do they like? What kind of cars do they drive? So it's very fascinating how much data you can actually provide or purchase about people. I always joke and say that as a marketer, I find it fascinating and very exciting. As a consumer, sometimes I get a little nervous, but it's pretty amazing what you can find today.
Okay, thank you. Then there are behavioral variables. So based on usage, attitudes regarding a particular product or service. So there might be a benefit. Which attribute of the product or service is most attractive to targets. So you can use some of those behavioral variables to actually develop campaigns. What's the user type? Potential users, first-time users, active customers, lapsed customers. So somebody had asked the question when they registered around, so what would my strategy be if I'm in stealth mode? Like I'm not ready for market yet. And, so this is potential users. So one of the things we can look at is if they're interested in a particular type of product or the things that surround a particular product. And I'll use another healthcare example, working with a client that has a piece of software that works with a camera, a specific kind of camera. You can actually start marketing to a disease type to kind of capture that audience and start talking to them before you go to market. So you want to look at, what is their interest, right? So what is most attractive to them to be learning about? And then we have usage, light, heavy, occasional usage. And I want to turn over to Maggie to talk about personas a little bit here, because I think this is a really important piece when developing your segments.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So I know personas is a very hot topic today. And personas is just truly thinking about your product and the experience with your product and developing a profile of that particular person. And I say person specifically because I know we've been talking about market segmentation, but when you do a persona exercise, one of the first instructions is sit down and actually think about one person who's going to sit down and engage with this product. And I know there is a question about how does this translate to B2B? One thing that I do mention, and we'll talk a little bit about business segmentation in the next slide, but the other thing to keep in mind is that when you're targeting businesses, you're still targeting people. So all of the things that Stephen just outlined are 100% in line with B2B targeting as well, because you're going to be looking for the people who are making the decisions on the purchasing of the different products. So think about that person. If I'm thinking about that medical device that Stephen was referring to, let's say it's a physician. A physician comes into the office and is using this. How is that person interacting with the device? How did they learn about it? What do they like about it? How do they use it with their patient? What benefits are driving from that? Literally put your mind into that person and then develop a profile. What does this person look like? And literally, I've used in the past what these slides as an outline. And I said, okay, what are the most relevant features of this person that I want to define? So for example, I'll create a header and I'll say, okay, I want to look at all of the demographic variables. Okay, I want to make sure that I'm focused on, gender might not be specific. I might not particularly target on gender, but do I want to target on their degree? So I want to make sure I'm focusing on MDs and DOs or NPs and PAs. If I want to, find information and I want to make sure that they're tech savvy so that I know that they're probably more interested in some new technology, I might be able to go after them. So usually literally using this as an outline and developing those personas. And oftentimes you'll find a lot of companies will, put a little flair to it and add clever names. So this particular person will represent a group or a segment that has a lot in common with that particular persona.
Thank you. Thanks, Maggie. So we just talked about segmentation based on business. So there are a lot of business attributes. You want to look at size of company, revenue, number of employees. There are a bunch of different things you can look at in terms of the business attributes that you may use for segmentation. Decision-making process or stage is another critical factor that you can look at. Operational factors, roles of decision makers. So you may want to segment based on, let's say, software and IT. Focus on the IT group, or if it's decision-making process, you may want to focus on the C-level. There are also some advanced segmentation pieces that you can focus on as well, that I'm going to turn over to Maggie to kind of just elaborate a little bit more on, because she mentioned it in the last slide.
Mm-hmm. And I also, yes, I definitely want to comment, especially on the B2B. So one other thing that is very important to remember when you're thinking about B2B segmentation are the different roles of the decision making. I know everyone out there has been in a situation, whether they were at a part of the decision making process or whether they were trying to sell something to decision makers. Everyone has a different role. There can be the C-suite folks who are actually making the decision and signing those checks. There are people who are actually using the product. There are gatekeepers who you have to get their approval, but they may not be using the product. There are a lot of different types of people that are involved in that decision-making process. And when you're developing your target market, you have to think to yourself, what are all the possible people that could possibly be involved in this particular process? And obviously that's going to be very different depending on the product that you're working with or the service that you're working with and the particular industry. But just making sure that you understand that decision-making process and then figuring out who fits into that. Maybe it's a job title, maybe it's a division, maybe it's a level, but just making sure that you keep that in mind. Okay?
Yeah.
The other thing that I wanted to talk about a little bit was, and I referred to this a little bit before, was the advanced segmentation. So there are a myriad of supplemental data sources. As I mentioned before, there are companies that you can actually get consumer data and marry that up to healthcare data, which is pretty revolutionary, and being able to tie the two of them together to make even more relevant messaging. We're getting to levels where we've never been in the past. And then there's a lot of companies that offer modeling services and the persona work. So I believe on the last slide, we do have some examples of tools that are available out there. Some of them are a little bit more on the pricey side. Some of them are a little bit more reasonable. But if you are looking to hit the ground running, you say, I need to start tomorrow. I don't have a target market. I don't know what I'm doing. I need to get data. Where do I look? There are a ton of different places that you can look. If I think about healthcare specifically, if anybody here is familiar with IMS Health, which is now IQVIA, they obviously have a lot of data services where you can procure, sizing and target lists and prescribing behavior around physicians and mid-level practitioners and things of that sort. There's also access to things such as the coding, the ICD-9, ICD-10 codes to be able to understand who's prescribing things. So there's a lot of different options out there. It's just a matter of getting out there and searching for them and being able to find a data provider who can hook you up with the right resources.
Mm-hmm. I want to add one more comment, Maggie, on the decision-making process or stage. One of the things you may want to look at in terms of a tactic is having marketing materials for people at different processes, different points of the decision-making process. So you can have white papers that help them kind of make their decisions easier, help them understand the industry. But there are all kinds of strategies where you can actually develop marketing pieces for anybody who's at every different phase of the sales cycle. Really important, and that content marketing strategy really does set you apart from your competitors, but also gives your end user the ability to make a decision, hopefully to go with your product or service.
Great.
Okay. So.
Perfect.
So now I have, I'm going to turn this back over to Maggie.
Great.
Another question.
Thank you, Stephen. Okay, so we've defined our segments. We're taking a look at this. We're sitting down, and let's say we've done the work and we said, okay, we have a bunch of different directions we can go. And as I mentioned before, one of my favorite sayings is jack of all trades, master of none. You can't go to every single segment in the world, whether it be limited budget, limited resources, time. So we need to pick 1, 2, however many that you need to pick. So how might we determine that one segment is more attractive than the other? What might be some ideas that you guys have? Where would you start? And I'll check the chat box to see any suggestions. The lower hanging fruit. The segment that you have the best chance at owning, based on return on investment, highest revenue potential, opportunity versus risk. These are all fantastic. How easy it is to capture market share, absolutely. All very, very relevant. Looking at barriers to entry, absolutely. It's actually, you guys are answering one of my questions on one of the subsequent slides, which is great. Perfect. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this is a very simple list, but it's actually a very helpful checklist. Some of the things that I list out here, a lot of people may have overlooked in the past. So I want to make sure that we put all of this out there. First of all, when you're looking at a segment, you have to ask yourself, is this segment accessible? So that means, am I actually able to reach this particular target segment? For some reason, are they blocked off? Can I, are there any barriers that I can't even get to them? This is a very extreme example, but one example that I really like to use is my sister. My sister is a farmer. She lives in the middle of nowhere, and she actually does not receive terrestrial radio. I love that term, terrestrial radio. So if I was going to try to reach her with a radio commercial, there's no way I would ever be able to get to her. Now, it's kind of an extreme example, but if you start to think about global markets, there are actually global markets that your accessibility is going to be very inhibited. So you have to make sure that whatever target market you do decide to go after, they're able to receive communications, you're able to reach them in some type of a way. Okay, substantial. So substantial, it essentially means, and this is kind of tied in with financially viable as well, is it large enough? Is it big enough for what I'm trying to do? And I know that someone had asked the question about being able to target smaller markets or niche markets. Substantial is a very subjective term, so depending on the company, substantial might actually equate to a smaller target market. I go back to thinking about physicians in healthcare. If I think about the hematology market, the total number of hematologists in the U.S., I believe as of last week, was somewhere just under 2,000 people. So obviously that particular target market is very, very small. If I even went to office-based hematologists, we're looking at about 900 and change. So that would be a smaller opportunity. However, they do have needs, and though it still might be substantial for what I'm trying to do. So just making sure that if you're going to go after the target market, it does represent a substantial or a significant opportunity. And tied into the financially viable, obviously they need to be able to afford what you're trying to provide. They need to understand if there are any regulations that are tied to it, if there's any reimbursement that's tied to it. You need to understand how that impacts it as well. So you need to understand what the financial impact of it is. So that goes to a lot of you guys were mentioning return on investment, being able to find the people who are most likely to spend the money on what you're trying to offer. Okay. Distinct from the whole, that's more of a definition checkbox. If you have a target segment and they have things in common, or they look almost identical to the full market, that's not truly a segment. That you're really going after a larger segment. It's just, it seems to be that you might have pulled out some just people for random reasons. So just making sure that that segment is distinct from the whole. It could be any of the different attributes that Stephen defined, but making sure that that group is very, very different from the larger group. So if you're looking at all of the different healthcare providers in the United States, whether it be, I'm going to segment based on specialty, I'm going to segment based on prescribing behavior, something to that nature. It needs to be measurable. This is something that I'm a huge proponent of, and any programs or business efforts that you're going to be doing, you need to make sure that you're measuring it and making sure that you are able to define what success is and being able to do that ahead of time. I actually mention that in every single training session that I've ever done. Doesn't matter what the topic is making sure we understand what does good look like and how we're going to define that, and then actually following through and seeing how that worked. So if you have a target market, for some reason you're not going to be able to measure that success, it's going to be very frustrating because you're never going to know whether or not you're doing well. And then finally, actionable. And actionable can mean a lot of different things as well. This is highly dependent on the strategic imperatives of your company. So there are some target markets that you just don't feel are plausible. They might be conflicting with a strategic imperative. For example, going back to the Dunkin' Donuts example, there might be a target market out there that might be more upscale, but Dunkin' Donuts won't go after them because it would dilute what they've been doing with their current messaging. So there could be reasons why you would not want to go after a particular segment for strategic reasons. Anything to add, Stephen?
No, I think that was really, really thorough. One of the things that I thought would be, what I would like to add here is, and we talked about this example earlier, Maggie, was if you are, let's say you're launching a Google AdWords campaign, Google AdWords is a great way to kind of test the financial viability. You can see what keywords, what creative, what campaign may work. You can also use tools. There's a tool that I like to use called SpyFu. spyfu.com. And what SpyFu allows you to do is you can actually see what your competitors are buying in terms of keywords. So you can see like what keywords are buying. I also want to add looking at competitors, doing competitor analysis, because that might help you think about what are the target markets that other people are looking for. Is there a gap somewhere in the marketplace that you can actually fill that somebody else is not filling with their product or service? So there's a lot here that I think is important, but definitely one tool that I'd recommend, which will help you with any keyword buys, which will also help you with SEO, search engine optimization to be found, is called SpyFu. So that's a good one. And at the end of this, after we're done with this, we're going to actually give you some more resources to help you, do your work a little bit, more thoroughly. Oh,
Great.
no, too far.
Perfect.
There we go.
Perfect. And actually, Stephen, that was a perfect segue, and some great tools to be able to dive into this. But once you understand what your target segments are, how do we decide which one to prioritize? And this is a very, top level approach to being able to define what that is, because it is so variable. So we are going to evaluate based on the size of that particular target market, what is the growth of that particular target market, the attractiveness based on the price of our particular product, how much they're going to pay for it, what the return is. But you also, as I mentioned before, have to balance that with the strategic imperative and capabilities of the company. So as I might have alluded to in the past, is that I might want to go after this giant whale of an opportunity, but if my company cannot support it from a resource perspective, whether it be financial, staffing, inventory, whatever that is, I need to make sure that if I'm going to go after a target segment, that I can support that. So there are a lot of different things that you have to take into consideration, and it's very highly dependent on your product, your industry, the target market that you do decide to go after. But what I recommend is sitting down and actually look at all the target markets, being able to do all of this analysis for each of them, and then compare them and balance that with the imperatives as well as your resources that may not be as tangible as the financials and the counts of the actual target market. The other thing I throw in here is, should we always select the largest, fastest growing targets market? Why or why not? The answer there is no. You don't necessarily have to go after the largest. You don't have to go after the fastest. And it ties into the second question, which is the competitive landscape. And Stephen alluded to this as well, is taking a look and saying, okay, what substitutes or competitors are already existing in this particular market? Who are they targeting? What are they offering? Can I do something different? That's another question and item that I bring up in everything, which is differentiation. You have to make sure that you have some type of sustainable differentiation. Otherwise, if you enter a market, there's no reason why existing customers should switch or should choose your particular product unless they understand why it's better than what already exists. So keep in mind that sometimes the smaller target markets are good to get experience, to get your name out there, to get traction. Don't always look for the largest, fast and growing. It could be that low-hanging fruit that you guys were talking about in the chat box. Okay.
Thanks, Maggie. So we're going to get into some case studies. And just for all of you to know, if you look in your chat box, I did put the name of the tool that I mentioned, SpyFu. So just make sure I mention that. So the first one is, this is a medical research organization we're working with. They provide human biospecimens for research. So one of the things that is a challenge for them is that they have so many different target markets. They work with human researchers across every disease state, every body segment. So their challenge is, how do we target best and effectively? So we started testing and messaging with keywords using new segments, using Google AdWords to test which segments may work best for them. So it's nice. We could do testing on keywords. We could do testing on which ones are most optimal. So one of the things that we did was we tested a bunch of different segments. We found out that neuro, anything related to neuro, was challenging because the keywords are expensive. Full organs were not as challenging because keywords were less expensive. So we got a much better return on those campaigns, and we pulled away from the neuro campaigns. So we're able to do landing pages, test those segments, see which ones are effective, not effective, are driving leads to the organization. So we're testing medical, military, CROs, aesthetic medicine, CMOs. So we're going through the process of developing campaigns to test each of these segments. The nice thing about going through Google AdWords first is that it also helps you with your SEO strategy. So you can optimize your site to attract those potential leads that are searching for those keywords, who will hopefully end up being leads and turn to new business for you. Here the main categories are for researchers, donors, and patients and partners. So they're in the process of, under the researcher space, of adding new categories based on these new target segments. So each segment will have a page on the site and resources available for anybody who goes to that page. I'll move on to the next one, this is Maggie.
Right. So taking a walk through an oncology medical device example. So this was a startup company that we had worked with a little while ago that offers a treatment for renal and prostate cancers. The technology at the time was brand new. It was had zero disease state, there was disease state recognition, but this particular treatment was brand new in the marketplace. So the goal was to launch this new technology, gain acceptance across the board. So the first thing obviously that needed to happen was we needed to decide who to go after. The budget was very limited, so they needed to be very specific in who they decided to target. They did decide to go after physicians with purchasing power within their offices, as well as hospital decision makers within the United States. Over time, they did expand to global markets. They also decided to expand to a secondary market, which was a patient effort. Which Stephen and I were just reflecting on before in regard to testing of search engine campaigns. But when they first launched, they really wanted to go after the groups that had the most purchase power and that could make the decision to actually place these devices in the offices. Because obviously, if they had decided to go after the patient group first, if the patient showed up at a hospital or at a doctor's office, there would be no way to receive the treatment that they were asking about. So this made the most sense for them to go after those physicians and hospital decision makers so that they can get these devices in place first before they started to drive demand through the patients themselves. Within the first 5 years of marketing, they were in over 100 locations and hospitals in the United States. And over the next several years after that, they launched across the globe. And I believe their sales force expanded to between 30 to 40. And that included a lot of different global territories.
Okay.
All right. I wanted to include this one as well. I know this is also a consumer entertainment brand, a little bit different than I think everybody's probably looking for. But I wanted to throw this in there because I believe this is a little bit more of a customer segmentation example. So to give you guys a little bit of a more very in the nitty gritty ways that you can actually look at your target market. So very specifically, we were looking to test direct mail. Direct mail is notorious for being very expensive, and we wanted to make sure that the juice is worth the squeeze, I guess is the best way to say it. If we're going to spend the money, we wanted to make sure that we got the return. So at the time, we were trying to get subscribers in the door. So what we did was we engaged our internal analytics team that we worked with. And we said, okay, we need to make sure that we're picking people who are most likely to respond to direct mail. So the analytics team performed a modeling exercise and actually developed smaller segment groups that were the fans, friends, and foes of direct mail. And basically what we looked at when we applied all the finances, we said if we eliminate that faux group, we would actually be able to be within budget, and the projections for the campaign would meet the expectations, and we would have the return on investment of what we were looking to do. Another really great point about this particular example is that sometimes the elimination of a segment is just as meaningful as identifying the top segment. Oftentimes, if you look at the fans, friends, and foes, you say, well, I should just go after the fans. If you looked at the percentages of the total audience, the fans were really only about 15 to 20% of the total customer segment. So if we had only gone after fans, we would not have hit our sales goals. But I'm able to go after fans and friends and just remove foes, and all of a sudden my buy becomes a lot more efficient. So throughout the program, everything was approved, ran it as planned, everything came in as expected, so it worked out very, very well. And these are the types of analyses that can happen to help you focus your efforts.
Okay, great. Thanks, Maggie. We don't have enough time for this segmentation exercise, but this is included in the deck that we'll share with everybody. So I don't know if you want to mention anything else about this exercise, Maggie, because I want to move on to questions and answers.
Yep, absolutely. Just something to keep in mind. As I mentioned before, if you're developing your personas, or if you're looking at your business plans or your marketing plans and you say to yourself, you know, what do I really need to include from a market segmentation perspective? This is a really great outline to use. So list it out, think about all of the different elements. This exercise will guide you.
Okay, thanks. So let's go on to Q&A. There's a Q&A button on your screen. So we're going to open up the questions.
Great. Actually, one that I do know Victoria had asked before was asking about determining the proper marketing mix and expected conversion rates for new products. Right. So I'll just answer that real quick, and then I know we have that tool slide as well.
Right, we had a tool slide too. I forgot about that.
Yep, no problem. So I wanted to make sure I address this. So I touched on this a little bit in the beginning. So as I mentioned, today we were talking about the target markets and how are we dividing our market segments. The second portion of that is, okay, now that we have our target markets defined, how are we actually going to reach out to them? What are we going to say to them? How do we develop our positioning? And that's really the question that you're getting at, is what's the next step? You know, how are we going to decide what channels are going to reach these people? If I'm to give you a really quick example off the top of my head, if I'm trying to reach out to businesses who are focused in one particular industry versus millennials who I'm trying to target for a new clothing line, the channels that I'm going to use to go after those two target markets are going to be vastly different. So the first question to ask yourself is, okay, what does this target market, where do they go? What do they read? Where do they get their information? What digital channels do they engage with? And that's really where you're going to be able to define those. And as Stephen mentioned before, testing is huge. And being able to go after a particular target market and test that channel in the digital space is more efficient than ever. So, you know, search. If, you know, let's put a search program out there, we can set our budget guidelines, we can see how it performs, and we can, if it's not working as well as we want it, we'll move on to something else. That's the beauty of digital, is being able to get out there and test things and see how people are reacting to things. And as Stephen provided, was that really great analysis tool that will let you actually take a look and see what's popular out there as well. One other thing, the conversion rates, that's a little bit different, a little bit more specific. I don't want to, conversion rates are very, very dependent upon, you know, what's good and what's not. That's a little bit of a more specific example. So if there was something specific you wanted to look at, we could definitely, you know, have a conversation and see how we could help you.
Okay. So Maggie, we had a tools and resources slide here. Again, we're running out of time. So I just want to, you know, there's some basic things we can do. Obviously Excel, Access, Google Analytics is a big key point for looking at data, looking at who's coming to your site. HubSpot has tools, marketing automation tools that actually help you automate your marketing efforts to your target audiences. Salesforce, obviously CRM, Microsoft Dynamics, CRM. Maggie mentioned Axiom, which is a data. Why don't you say more about Axiom, Experian, Maggie, on this?
Yep, absolutely. So Axiom and the Experians of the world, those are the geodemographic modeling companies where, if you have a particular target list that you're looking to go after and you're trying to assign consumer data to them or anything like that, they're definitely on the pricier side, but they're going to be able to help you define personas, be able to append all sorts of information to that particular target list, as well as they can help guide with particular channels and even specific, like for example, if I want to know what websites this particular target list frequents the most, they would be able to help with that as well. The other thing that I will point out in here, there are a lot of other data resources that if you're looking to establish a new target list, so you're not starting from scratch, or if you need to append a target list that you might have with other information, those resources are almost endless. So if you need something specific, happy to, if you want to reach out, we can see what we can do.
So I just want to, on that note, we got a question from somebody, from Glenn. He asks, how do you go about building a contact database or finding sources of data, contact lists, for individuals based on psychographics? Mm-hmm. So I'm going to throw it over to you, Maggie. Do you have any thoughts on that?
And that's exactly what I was just talking about. So if I use, like, for example, if I go back to my hematology example, if I wanted to procure a list of all hematologists in the United States, I can work with IMS Health, or there's a lot of different resellers of that particular data. There's obviously restrictions on how it can be used, but typically it is allowed for marketing purposes. So being able to go and license that data and then saying, okay, what companies can allow me to get additional information? So first I have the target list. I have their their address, their name, their NPI number, their medical educator number. If I need to append any AMA data, I can go ahead and do that. There are places where I can actually find their email addresses. If they're related to associations, I can work with publishers to be able to match and see if they're a subscriber of the different publications. And then there are companies that can append that psychographic information. And those are some of the more those larger companies like the Axioms of the world. And if you need some more names, we can provide those. Yeah. Axiom's much more, they're a huge company. They're focused across primarily consumer markets and things like that. But there are companies that are able to work in the healthcare space specifically.
Yeah. And we can provide a list of some other options that are available. Mm-hmm. So I want to just quickly, where do we go from here? Maggie, you actually talked about this, developing value proposition, differentiation and positioning, obviously creating a communication strategy once you develop your segmentation strategy. So key messaging, channels, analytics, budget, testing, etc. So I want to open up again for questions. We have a few minutes left to see if there were any other outstanding questions.
We covered everything.
Charles, do you have any outstanding questions?
No, I think you guys have been very comprehensive. No questions for me. Okay. Oh, here we go. How can you test price sensitivity? Mm-hmm.
Yes, so this is a tricky question, and this is also specific to how you're actually distributing your products. So there are a couple of different schools of thought. The first is, and I've been down this path, which is, okay, well, let's do some market research to see if we can determine what the price sensitivity is. Let's go out and actually ask the question, how much would you pay for this, or give them some sort of range. There's a lot of different ways you can approach that. I would always say research is a really great way to start. However, I wouldn't put all of your eggs in the research basket. The reason is because if you ask someone how much they're going to pay for something, oftentimes the decision that or the choice that they make in that process is much different than when then they're actually going through the buying process. For example, if you came to me and said, would you buy a Mercedes for $100? Yeah, I'll always say yes. It's a little ridiculous. But, or actually even say Mercedes at the normal price, I'd say, sure, I would, because I think that's what a Mercedes is valued. But if you actually tried to sell me a Mercedes, I can't afford a Mercedes, so I'm not going to purchase it. So you just have to be careful that when you're doing research, you're understanding that it's it's more attitudinal than it is behavioral. Then if you flip to the behavioral side, there are digital methods, especially the digital space is obviously the most flexible. If your product is a type of product that you can distribute through digital channels, there are ways to be able to set up sites to be able to have variable pricing, to actually offer them at different times and randomly throughout audiences, so you can actually shift things if you need to. I'm trying to think if you have to, the only thing you need to do is be careful. A lot of people are not very familiar with this, but Amazon, actually the prices on their site vary based on whoever's logged in as well as geography. So it always blows my mind because I might pay more for something than one of my friends in Texas, which blows my mind. But especially with smaller target markets, you have to be very careful, because if for some reason one person talks to another person and they shared how much they purchased something for, you have to make sure that you're containing that and being able to address that. So just one of those potholes you'll have to keep an eye out for.
Yeah. So Maggie, Victoria is asking a question that we talked about earlier, which is, what is a good testing budget for an early stage startup? And this is a tricky one, because a lot of this really depends on, what you're testing, what industry you're testing. As I mentioned my example earlier, with the company I was working with, they're a nonprofit actually, and they wanted to test neuro versus whole organ. And the price for the keyword for neuro was almost 4 times as much as a whole organ campaign. So it's establishing what is a good starting budget really is a tricky one, because it really depends on how competitive your marketplace is, because that becomes much more expensive, obviously. Do you require a lot of education, which again increase your cost, because if you have a new technology or service or product, how do people understand what that product is? Now, you're also asking about, what about a mobile app? There are all kinds of ways you could test marketing via mobile. Again, it's really looking at how competitive that space is and how expensive those keywords are going to be. I don't know, Maggie, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, the other thing you need to keep in mind, and I hate to also say it's variable based on a lot of different factors, but whenever it comes to budgets and marketing, a lot of it is very dependent on what type of target market you're going after. But it truly is driven by the target market. As I talked about before, your target market is going to demand different channels based on who they are. So you might have a target market that is only accessible by many more expensive channels. One particular target market might really need the direct sales, which obviously is super expensive to support. However, you might have another target market that is very digital, very focused on being able to engage with email, search engine, all sorts of different digital elements that might be a little bit more accessible at the time. So that also should come into play with how you're trying to launch. Is there a target market, and what channels are they really focused in? Because that's also going to determine your market budget.
Yeah. Yeah, and one other thing that Victoria is asking is, aren't the conversion rates important? Because they can help you determine how much you need to spend to get the results you want, which I think is an excellent point. And without doing the testing, you're not going to really understand what the conversion rates are going to be. Generally in digital, anything from 2% up is a really good conversion rate. But again, I've seen working on one campaign where the conversion rate is 8%. Which is pretty high, but they're a long tail sale. So it takes anywhere from 3 months to 9 months for that sale to happen. So once a lead comes in, it has to be cultivated. So again, it's really challenging. You can have a 1% conversion rate, but you get a lot of leads. So it really is dependent upon the price of your product. As Maggie mentioned, if you need a direct contact, especially if it's more expensive, the more direct contact you're probably going to need. So, there are a lot of different variables. And again, without looking at your specifics, it's hard to really weigh in a kind of rule of thumb kind of way.
The other thing I'll add to that is that the only thing that I will add to that is being able to put a very stringent tracking and success measurement plan in place ahead of time. So oftentimes we hear, okay, well, what should we expect? What are the benchmarks? What should we set them at? What I've done in the past is, checked to see if I have any other colleagues or contacts or agencies that can help me set those benchmarks, because they might have worked in this space before and they might have the benefit to be able to guide us in that way. But if we're not putting a measurement plan in place to be able to track those over time, because your situation might be much different than any benchmarks that are already out there, the best thing, as Stephen mentioned, is that when we start to test, let's see what those rates look like and let's track them. Because if we're not tracking them, obviously we're not going to be able to understand how things are performing.
Mm-hmm. There's one more question I'd like us to take. It's 2:00, but I think it's a good one. How important is branding to a company's success? Does the size of a company have an effect on this focus? So I want to see I think brand equity, which is what you're talking about. Having a strong brand absolutely has a tremendous impact. Having a strong brand can increase your conversion rates. It can increase your leads. Having a strong brand is critical to the segmentation piece, especially if you're known within a specific segment. So Maggie, do you have anything else to add before we wrap up?
Yep, absolutely. And I think the key word for this, actually two key words, is one is differentiation and the second one is consistency. So understanding how you're different from your competitors or any other options, as I talked about before, making sure that the brand is reflecting that and making sure that it's consistent across the board. So if your website has a very particular look and feel and has a lot of messaging associated with it, making sure that that's pulled through in all of your different materials, whether it be press releases, websites, within your employee, like your actual office, how the offices feel and how you're communicating your values in your company to your employees. Everything communicates together, and you need to make sure that everything is consistent to be able to build that very strong brand.
Okay.
All right. Well, Stephen and Mary, thank you so much for your insights. This has been an awesome webinar. Just for everyone in the audience, we're going to send a follow-up message with the webinar attached so you can view it again and share it with your peers. And we'll follow up with a content piece on some other tools and resources for you guys as well. So stay tuned for that. Thank you guys again, and have a great day.
All right,
Thanks so much.